Greetings, AP Euro scholars, for our unit on Unit 4 on the Scientific Revolution and the Enlightenment. I'm looking at a review sheet class here from top to bottom, and Galileo and the Inquisition. Why? What's going on here? Well, the official story is, the received story is that Galileo is on trial for heliocentrism. But keep in mind here, we went over some of the larger facts here. The church is largely supporting the university system, the observatories, the study of astronomy. Galileo's writings were feted, and he was invited to the Vatican. He is a scientific hero. So what's going on here? What has he done? Well, he is using private interpretation, and he is challenging the church's traditional view at the same time, approximately here, that Martin Luther is stirring the waters up in Germany. But more importantly, Galileo has insulted the Pope's views in a book in which he had promised to give both sides to sort of appease the scholastic world in the universities. And keep in mind here also, at the same time that Galileo is being punished, where he's under house arrest, Kepler is publicizing his elliptical views of heliocentrism at the same time here. So there's more to this story. The church is not against science. That is the untold story about Galileo. The significance of Francis Bacon, the inductive or the scientific method, using reason to advance science. René Descartes is the advocate of the deductive method. And this cogito ergo sum, meaning I think therefore I am, is introducing doubt and skepticism as the basis of knowledge. Investigate for yourself. Remember that reading we did, Bacon against the idols of received information and knowledge, which is often Aristotelian and scholastic and incorrect. Descartes is saying, think for yourself. Examine what's out there. Remember, he's famous for splitting reality in half into mind and matter. This is Cartesianism, casting doubts. Now, he's not an atheist or anything like that, but the extension here is casting doubt on faith itself. Isaac Newton introduces this mechanistic view of the universe with his ideas on the laws of gravitational attraction. And again, he is a Christian, and what's significant here is this idea is if we're made in God's image, then we can decipher the mechanistic nature of the universe created by this God. And you get out of this idea of deism, that the universe has been created by a reliable creator who is not necessarily personal, who stepped back, but whose creation is decipherable by human beings. Salons, these are these places of discussion in France, often hosted by wealthy female patrons. And the philosophes, these are reformers, largely French reformers, who are advocating political reform. They're challenging the monarchy and they're challenging the church. Thomas Hobbes and Leviathan, which is his book, he is a critic of the English Civil War. He sees the dethronement and the arrest, trial, and execution of Charles I as a great tragedy. He's famous for, not Charles, but Thomas Hobbes is famous for saying that we are born in the natural state free, but in this freedom we are in a state of war. He's got that famous quote, life in the natural state alone and free is poor, solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. And his solution here is we enter a social contract in which we turn power over to the state, over to the king, over to the Leviathan, and that state is permanent. He's an advocate of absolute monarchy, but not from divine right, but from the basis of social contract. We need safety in the midst of this violence in our natural free state. John Locke puts a different spin here on the thinking of Hobbes. Locke is going to say that we do enter a social contract, but this contract is not permanent. It is provisional. It is conditional. It is consensual on our rights being protected. We are free with rights, and we create the state to protect those rights. In other words, if you sort of think about it, we're all free, but in our freedom, when we're off at work, other people are going to be breaking our doors down and stealing our stuff. So we turn over some of our freedom to a government to protect us. And that, again, that's conditional. We have the right, and you see this in the Declaration of Independence, which is very openly cribbed by Thomas Jefferson. We have a right to, in fact, a duty to change that government. if it should not protect our rights. Locke's tabula rasa, this is this idea that we are born as a blank slate, tabula rasa, and through education we can create a more just government, a more just society. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, another Enlightenment thinker, and how is he different from Hobbes and Locke? He writes a document called The Social Contract, but he says government is not based on individual freedom, but on the general will. Our freedom is found within the context of the group, the community, a greater society. And the question that sort of hangs out there is, if our freedom is part of the general will, presumably democratic, what happens if that general will turns out to be fascistic or Nazi or communist? So just something to be thinking about here, this idea of a general will. Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws. Main idea here is a just government, a good government divides into three branches, like what he sees across the English Channel in England, a king limited by Parliament that has kept its independence. And there is this division of power, this checks and balance in England, which he's going to want to import to France. Voltaire is an advocate of freedom of expression, freedom of religion. He is the author of Candide, which is this very popular satirical novel about a young man who's being tutored, who's being taught by this teacher, and he's being told that everything is well, but he sees the world as a sort of a broken, fallen. It's not a religious book here. A broken place with a lot of wrong in it. And this book, as a satire, contains criticism of religion, criticism of government, criticism of philosophy. It's very sarcastic, very witty. Voltaire becomes sort of a literary hero. But what's implied in this book is not just pessimism or fatalism, but a challenge to the status quo. And there's that quote from Voltaire, "We must cultivate our garden." What does it exactly mean? It means we need to make things better. And he's got that famous quote, "Crush the infamous thing," meaning crush the despotism of the Catholic Church. Enlightened despotism, also you'll see this in some history books, is enlightened monarchy. And this is the idea that a king is going to use Enlightenment thought, Enlightenment values to prosper his or her kingdom without giving up control. The three that are usually held up in our history books are Catherine the Great, who's famous for collecting art, and you see this now in the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. She corresponded with Voltaire for 15 years. She had this grand commission where she had hundreds of members of all the classes meet to discuss the needs of the empire and to give suggestions. They met like 200 times, and she took none of these suggestions to heart. There is no restraint on her power. She sets up schools for girls, but there's really no progress in setting up a national school system. So she's more talk than actual action. Frederick the Great. Frederick the Great, a great artist, wrote sonatas and symphonies, played musical instruments, multilingual. He was an advocate and a proponent, and he allowed religious toleration in Prussia. He promoted industry, he promoted agricultural reform, different crops, turnips and potatoes, and credit for farmers. He supported art, he supported education. He took Cesare Beccaриa's advice here on ending torture. He ended the death penalty with the exception for treason. He allowed freedom of the press and freedom of speech. So kind of a radically liberal government here in Prussia under Frederick II, or Frederick the Great, as he's better known as. Joseph II of Austria also allowed freedom of the press, freedom of religion. He pushed for reform of the judicial system. He abolished serfdom. He fostered centralization. And Joseph famously takes over the monasteries to kind of put the church in its place. Mary Wollstonecraft, one of the famous proto-feminists that remember the AP is very, very, there's a lot of feminist history. You need to know what women are doing everywhere all the time. And her vindication of the rights of women is a criticism of Rousseau's statements that women are intellectually weak, belong in the home. She is an advocate specifically for the education of women. She says, and she's very astute here, she says the education of women is not just a right for a woman, but benefits men by benefiting all of humans by allowing women to use their mind for the common good. Cesare Beccaria is this Italian advocate for more leniency in punishment. You don't need to be harsh to have justice, to have order. He says we can limit the punishment of crime. We don't have to be cruel. We don't have to be killing people. Denis Diderot is the author and the editor of 17 volumes of the Encyclopedia in France, which contain thousands and thousands of entries. It's supposed to be a compendium of all known knowledge. But what's controversial about here is his irreverence towards the Catholic Church, and is essentially challenging the absolute monarchy of the Bourbon dynasty. And he is several times, his encyclopedia is censored. And Catherine the Great, just to note, she promises him that she will publish this encyclopedia if it's ever, totally censored in France. To my knowledge, that does not ever happen, but another one of these sympathies of Catherine. Baruch Spinoza, a Jewish philosopher, not as well known as some of these other Christian philosophers because he's Jewish, and he says God is in nature, and he's kind of a pantheist, but the significance of him is not some abstract pantheism, but he says to do science, to use reason, is to worship God. God is, he's behind the existence of everything, and that as we use our knowledge, our reason to make inquiry, we are discovering the mind of God. We're discovering God. We are essentially worshiping. Adam Smith and his invisible hand, remember, he is an opponent of mercantilism. His book is The Wealth of Nations, and he's an advocate of laissez-faire, free trade. Stop this government regulation, this government interference. He says that trade is not a zero sum. If you buy something from some other nation, you have not permanently lost that wealth. That trade overall benefits all through the movement of an invisible hand is a metaphor. And the contrast here with an earlier thinker, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, is the proponent and the describer of mercantilism, that regulation is good, it's necessary. You need to have high tariffs and government subsidies. The government needs to promote some economic activity and discourage any trade that would diminish, that would put the balance of trade against you with gold and silver and things flowing out. So some thoughts here on the Enlightenment. You might want to think of the Enlightenment a little bit as a continuation of the scientific revolution, where the scientific revolution is focusing on the natural world, on science. The Enlightenment more so is applying science to human relationships, to government, and perhaps to religion. And often the scientific revolution is given that date in around 1450 or so, when Copernicus is publishing about his heliocentric views. And the Enlightenment is sort of approximately the 1700s, with, of course, some buffer on both sides. So there you go. There's our drive-by review. Good luck, scholars. Signing out.